Robert J. Schmidt, the most feared mafia kingpin in the city, sat in total darkness, his eyes fixed on a high-definition monitor. Moments ago, he had kissed his beautiful fiancée Mary goodbye, pretending to leave for an emergency meeting in Chicago. But as the gates of his estate closed, the woman he planned to marry did something that turned his blood to ice. He watched in silence as the elegant Mary R. Williams wiped his kiss from her cheek with a look of pure disgust and walked straight into his sick mother's room, not to comfort her, but to begin a reign of terror. Robert thought he was hiding to test her loyalty, but he was about to witness a betrayal so deep and an act of courage from a humble maid so unexpected that it would change the course of his life forever. Stay tuned, because what the cameras caught next will leave you speechless. The heavy iron gates of the Schmidt estate groaned shut with a finality that usually brought Robert a sense of security. Today, however, it signaled the start of a silent war. Inside the mansion, hidden behind the mahogany shelves of his sprawling library, Robert J. Schmidt sat in a room that didn't officially exist. The air was cool, smelling of ozone and expensive leather, and the only light came from the wall of monitors displaying every corner of his home in crystalline detail. On the main screen, he watched his fiancée, Mary R. Williams. She stood on the grand portico, a delicate silk handkerchief pressed to her eyes, waving at the black SUV that she believed was carrying Robert to the airport for an emergency flight to Chicago. She looked every bit the grieving bride-to-be, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed, her designer dress hugging a frame that radiated elegance and high society grace. "Target is clear of the driveway, boss." Marcus's voice crackled through a small earpiece. Robert didn't respond. His eyes were glued to Mary. The second the SUV disappeared past the tree line, the transformation began. It was like watching a film reel glitch. Mary's shoulders dropped, the grief vanished from her posture, and she lowered the handkerchief. She didn't just stop crying. She looked annoyed that she'd had to perform at all. She turned back toward the house, her face hardening into a mask of cold arrogance. She spat on the very steps where they had shared a glass of vintage champagne just an hour prior. "Finally," she muttered, her voice picked up by the high-sensitivity microphones. "The air in this tomb is already starting to clear." Robert felt a cold prickle at the base of his neck. He had built an empire on his ability to read people, yet he realized in that heartbeat that he had never truly seen the woman he'd shared a bed with for the last year. Mary didn't head to the kitchen or the parlor. She marched straight to Robert's private study, a room she was strictly forbidden from entering without him. She kicked the door open with the heel of her Louboutins and picked up the landline. "It's me," she said into the receiver, her voice dropping into a low, sultry purr that Robert had once found intoxicating. Now, it sounded like a snake's hiss. "He's gone." The fool actually believed the Chicago emergency Julian cooked up. "Yes, tell Julian to come over. Use the service entrance and bring the papers. We have a lot of work to do before my darling Robert returns to find his kingdom has a new king." Robert's hand tightened around the armrest of his chair until the leather groaned. He wasn't just watching a betrayal of the heart. He was watching a calculated assassination of his life's work. The mask hadn't just slipped, it had shattered, revealing a monster he had personally invited into his home. As he watched Mary pour a glass of his most expensive whiskey and toast her own reflection, Robert realized the test had only just begun, and the price of failure was going to be blood. The surveillance monitors in Robert's bunker hummed with a low, rhythmic electric pulse that mirrored the pounding in his chest. On screen 4, the service entrance at the rear of the mansion flickered. A man in a dark, nondescript trench coat slipped through the door, moving with the practiced ease of someone who had used this entrance many times before. Robert leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. It was Julian Vane. Julian wasn't just a rival. He was a man Robert had once considered a protégé, someone he had brought into the inner circle of the Schmidt Syndicate's legitimate logistics arm. Seeing him here, in the heart of his home while he was supposed to be in Chicago, was a knife to the gut. The cameras followed Julian as he moved through the shadows of the hallway and into the private study. Mary didn't greet him with the professional distance of a business associate. The moment the door clicked shut, she threw herself into his arms. Robert watched in stony silence as his fiancée, the woman he had presented to the world as the future Mrs. Schmidt, kissed Julian with a hunger she had never shown him. "Did you get the signature?" Julian asked, pulling back just enough to look at her. "Not yet," Mary whispered, her voice amplified by the hidden microphones Robert had installed only days prior. "The old woman is being stubborn. She's more lucid than the doctor said she'd be. But don't worry, Robert is out of the way for at least 48 hours. By the time he returns, Martha will have signed the power of attorney over to me, and your companies will have the exclusive shipping rights to the East Coast docks." Julian chuckled, a dry, grating sound. "And Robert? He's not a man who takes kindly to being robbed, Mary." Mary poured another glass of whiskey, her eyes glinting with a terrifying malice. "Robert is a dinosaur. He thinks loyalty is bought with fear and old-fashioned codes. He has no idea that his empire is built on sand. Once the assets are transferred, we won't need him anymore. Accidents happen to men in his line of work every day. A botched hit, a car failure, the police won't even look twice." Robert felt a cold, predatory calm settle over him. He wasn't just watching a cheating fiancé, he was watching a coup. He reached for his phone to call Marcus and end it then and there, but his hand stopped. On the screen, Mary checked her diamond-encrusted watch. "Enough about Robert. I have to go deal with that wretched Maid and his mother. They're both beginning to irritate me." Robert watched her leave the study, his finger hovering over the record button. He realized he couldn't just kill them, not yet. He needed to see exactly how deep the rot went, and he needed to know if there was anyone left in his world who wasn't a traitor. As Mary headed toward his mother's medical suite, Robert switched the main feed to Martha's room. The real horror was only beginning. The feed on the central monitor switched to the West Wing, where the air was thick with the sterile scent of antiseptic and the rhythmic hum of life support machinery. This was Martha's sanctuary, the room where Robert's mother, the woman who had raised him in the gutter and helped him build a throne, now lay fighting for her breath. Robert watched as Mary burst into the room. She didn't check the IV bag or brush the hair from the old woman's forehead. Instead, she slammed the door so hard the glass in the medicine cabinet rattled. Martha flinched, her pale, frail hand clutching at the silk sheets. "Still hanging on, are we?" Mary sneered, her voice dripping with a venom Robert hadn't known she possessed. She walked over to the heart rate monitor, its steady beep, 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 a testament to Martha's resilience. "You're a stubborn old bird, I'll give you that. But your son is gone, and I'm tired of the noise." With a casual, bored flick of her wrist, Mary reached behind the machine and toggled the power switch. The rhythmic beeping died instantly, replaced by a haunting, hollow silence. Martha's eyes widened in fear, her chest heaving as the anxiety of the sudden quiet took hold. "That's better," Mary sighed, crossing her arms. She moved to the bedside table and picked up a bowl of specially prepared broth that had been left there by the morning shift. Without a hint of hesitation, she turned and poured the contents into a nearby wastebasket. "You don't need this. You're just wasting Robert's money and my time." Robert's jaw was set so tight, his teeth felt like they might shatter. He watched as his mother tried to speak, her voice a mere rasp. "Robert, where is my son?" "Robert is exactly where I want him," Mary laughed, leaning down until her face was inches from Martha's. "And he's never coming back for you. He's realized what I realized months ago, that you're just a heavy, useless weight around his neck. I'm the one in charge now, Martha. And in my house, we don't feed the shadows." She turned on her heel and walked out, leaving the elderly woman in total darkness, the vital monitors dead, and the room echoing with the sound of a mother's labored, terrified breathing. Robert sat in the surveillance room, his heart a cold stone, realizing that the woman he had loved was not just a liar, but a predator who preyed on the helpless. He felt a roar of rage building in his chest, but then the camera caught a flicker of movement at the door. Someone else was coming. The door to the darkened room creaked open, admitting a sliver of warm light from the hallway. Robert's hand, which had been reaching for the intercom to end Mary's life right then and there, paused. On the screen, a small, unassuming figure stepped into the frame. It was Clara Thorne, the maid Robert had hired months ago, but whose face he had never bothered to truly memorize. To him, she had been a shadow, a ghost who cleaned his floors and stayed out of the way. Clara stood at the foot of Martha's bed, her eyes widening as she noticed the dark, silent monitors. She didn't hesitate. She rushed to the wall, her fingers flying over the switches until the life-giving beep, beep, returned to the room. "Oh, Martha," Clara whispered, her voice a soothing balm compared to Mary's acidic tone. She reached out and took Martha's trembling hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm so sorry. I came as fast as I could." Robert watched as Clara moved with a grace that had nothing to do with high society and everything to do with humanity. She went to the wastebasket, looking down at the spilled broth with the expression of pure heartbreak. She didn't complain. She simply knelt on the cold floor, wiped up the mess, and then pulled a thermos from her apron pocket. "I knew she wouldn't feed you," Clara murmured, pouring a fresh, steaming cup of soup. "I made this in my own kitchen this morning. It's my grandmother's recipe. It'll put the strength back in your bones." As Clara carefully lifted Martha's head to help her sip, she began to talk. She didn't talk about the Mafia, or money, or the power struggles in the house. She told Martha about the birds she had seen in the garden that morning and how the roses were starting to bloom. She treated the old wait like a queen. "Why do you stay, child?" Martha rasped after a few sips, her voice stronger. "Mary, she is dangerous. If she finds you helping me—" Clara smiled, though Robert could see her hands shaking. "Mr. Robert loved you enough to build this room for you, Martha, even if he's too blind to see what's happening right now. Someone has to be your light in the dark. I'm not leaving you alone with her. Not today. Not ever." In the surveillance room, Robert felt a lump form in his throat. He had spent his life looking for loyalty in blood oaths and million-dollar deals, never realizing that the most profound loyalty in his house belonged to the woman he had treated like furniture. He watched Clara Thorne, the invisible maid, and for the first time in years, the cold-hearted Robert J. Schmidt felt a flicker of shame. He wasn't just watching a caregiver, he was watching a hero. The clock on the surveillance wall ticked toward midnight, but Robert hadn't moved. His eyes were fixed on screen 6, which showed the small Spartan staff quarters in the basement of the estate. While Mary and Julian were upstairs in his master suite, likely toasting to his demise with his own vintage wine, Clara Thorne was finally ending her 18-hour shift. Robert watched as the young woman sat at a small wooden desk. She looked exhausted, her shoulders slumped under the weight of the day's abuse. He saw her reach under her thin mattress and pull out a small, worn, leather-bound ledger. It wasn't a diary of teenage dreams. As she opened it and began to write, the high-definition zoom revealed a meticulously kept record of horror. Tuesday, 2 p.m. Ms. Williams refused to allow the nurse inside. Tuesday, 4 p.m. Broth discarded. Martha cried for water. I provided it in secret. Robert felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Clara wasn't just being kind. She was building a case. She was documenting every single instance of neglect and every suspicious visitor who entered the service door. She was doing the job his own security team had failed to do because they had been bought or blinded by Mary's status. Clara paused her writing, leaning her head against her hand. She pulled a crumpled photograph from her pocket, a young boy in a hospital gown. Robert recognized the boy from her personnel file. It was her younger brother, Leo, who suffered from a rare heart condition. This was why she endured Mary's slaps and insults. She needed the insurance, the paycheck, and the roof over her head to keep that boy alive. "I'm so close, Leo," she whispered, her voice barely audible through the mic. "If I can just get this book to Mr. Robert when he returns, if he's the man Martha says he is, he'll stop them. He has to." Robert leaned back in his chair, his face a mask of stone, but his mind was racing. He had spent years believing that everyone had a price, that loyalty was something you extracted through fear. Yet here was a woman who had every reason to run, every reason to stay quiet to protect her own interests, and instead, she was risking her life for a woman she barely knew and a boss who didn't even know her last name. He realized then that the ledger in her hand was the most dangerous weapon in the house. It wasn't just a record of Mary's crimes, it was a mirror reflecting Robert's own failures. He had let a viper into his bed and ignored the saint in his kitchen. As Clara tucked the journal back into its hiding place and blew out her candle, Robert made a silent vow. She wouldn't have to wait for his return. The man Martha said he was already in the house, and he was hungry for justice. The tension that had been simmering in the Schmidt estate finally boiled over on the third day of Robert's absence. On the monitors, the atmosphere in the house felt heavy, like the static before a lightning strike. Robert watched as Mary paced the hallway outside Martha's room, her face twisted in a mask of pure irritation. She was losing her patience, the old woman was living too long, and Clara was being too attentive. Clara emerged from the kitchen carrying a fresh glass of water and a small tray of soft fruit. She moved quietly, hoping to slip past, but Mary stepped into her path, blocking the doorway. "Where do you think you're going with that?" Mary asked, her voice dangerously low. "Martha hasn't had a drink in 4 hours, Ms. Williams," Clara replied, her voice trembling but her gaze steady. "The doctor said hydration is—" Before Clara could finish, Mary's hand flashed out. The sound of the slap echoed through the hallway and into Robert's surveillance speakers. Clara's head snapped to the side, the glass falling from the tray and shattering across the marble floor. "I told you to stay out of that room," Mary hissed, stepping over the broken glass until she was inches from Clara's face. "You are a servant, a zero. You think because Robert isn't here you can play hero? You're lucky I haven't tossed you out on the street yet." Clara stood her ground, even as a red welt bloomed on her cheek. "You can hit me all you want, but she is his mother. How can you treat her like this?" Mary laughed, a cold, hollow sound. She reached out and grabbed Clara by the jaw, forcing her to look up. "Listen to me, you little rat. I know about your brother Leo. I know about the hospital bills. If I hear so much as a whisper from that room, or if you ever speak a word of this to Robert, I won't just fire you. I'll make sure the hospital pulls his funding. I'll make sure he never gets that heart. Do you understand me?" Robert stood up so quickly his chair flipped backward. His hand went to the heavy brass handle of the secret door, his knuckles white. He watched Clara's spirit break in real time. She didn't cry for herself, but the mention of her brother extinguished the light in her eyes. She looked down at the shards of glass, defeated. "Yes, Ms. Williams," Clara whispered, her voice barely a breath. Mary patted her cheek mockingly and straightened her own dress. "Good. Now clean this up. It's a mess, just like you." As Mary sauntered away toward the study to meet Julian, Robert sat back down, his breathing ragged. He had seen enough. The predators were confident, and the innocent were suffering. It was time to remind everyone in this house why the name Schmidt was feared. But first, he had to hear the final part of their plan. He had to know just how much blood they intended to spill. The air in the surveillance bunker felt heavy as Robert watched Screen 2. In his private study, the air was thick with the smoke of expensive cigars. Mary leaned over his mahogany desk, her fingers tracing the edge of a document with predatory glee. Julian Vane stood behind her, his hands resting on her shoulders in a display of ownership that made Robert's vision blur with rage. "It's all here," Julian murmured, sliding a fountain pen toward her. "The modified will and the power of attorney. Once Martha is out of the way, the transition will be seamless. Robert's mental state will be too fragile after his mother's passing to handle the business. We'll have him committed to a private facility, and I'll take over the chairmanship of the board." Mary laughed, a cold, sharp sound that echoed through the monitors. "And what about the accident for Martha? We can't wait much longer. That little rat Clara is making it difficult to keep the equipment turned off." Julian leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Tomorrow night, a simple overdose of her medication. With the monitors already having technical issues, no one will know the difference. It will look like her heart simply gave out. By the time Robert's plane lands, he'll be returning to a funeral and a mountain of legal papers he's too broken to read." Mary signed the document with a flourish, her eyes gleaming. "To the death of the Schmidt legacy," she toasted, raising her glass, "and the birth of ours." Robert watched as they clinked glasses. They weren't just stealing his money, they were planning to murder his mother and erase his sanity. He reached for the master console, his finger hovering over the alarm. He had heard enough. The trap was set, and the rats were inside. It was time to close the cage. Robert's eyes snapped to screen 1. Mary had cornered Clara at the top of the grand marble staircase. In Mary's hand was the small, leather-bound ledger, Clara's secret journal. "You thought you were clever, didn't you?" Mary's voice was a shrill, jagged blade. She shook the book in Clara's face. "Tracking my visitors? Recording every time I neglected that old hag? You're not a maid, you're a spy." Clara backed away, her hands trembling as she reached for the banister. "That book belongs to me. It's the truth, Mary. Everything in there is what you've done to a woman who can't defend herself." "The truth is whatever I say it is," Mary roared, her face contorting with a feral desperation. She knew if Robert ever saw this book, her life was over. She looked over the railing at the cold marble floor 3 stories below. "Do you know what happens to people who stick their noses into Schmidt business? They have accidents. Tragic, fatal accidents." Behind her, Julian appeared from the shadows of the study, his face devoid of emotion. "We can't let her leave with that information, Mary. Do it." Mary lunged forward, grabbing Clara by the shoulders. Clara fought back, her small frame no match for Mary's adrenaline-fueled rage. "Please!" Clara cried out, her foot slipping on the edge of the top step. "Think about my brother." "Your brother can join you in the afterlife," Mary hissed, putting her full weight into a final, murderous shove. In the bunker, Robert stood up, his face a mask of absolute fury. He didn't just watch anymore. He hit the master override on the console. "Now!" he growled. Suddenly, every light in the mansion vanished, plunging the hall into a terrifying, suffocating darkness. Mary's hands froze as a voice boomed through the house, not from a person, but from the very walls themselves. It was Robert's voice, amplified and cold as the grave. "In my house, Mary," the voice echoed, "we don't feed the shadows, we become them." The emergency red lights of the mansion flickered on, casting long, bloody shadows across the foyer. Mary froze, her hands still locked on Clara's shoulders. Julian's hand moved toward the holster at his hip, but he stopped dead. Standing at the base of the grand staircase was Marcus and 4 of Robert's most loyal enforcers, their weapons drawn and eyes as cold as the grave. "Let her go, Mary," a voice commanded from the top of the stairs. Mary spun around. Emerging from the shadows of the secret library door was Robert. He wasn't the blind fool she had mocked. He looked like the god of vengeance, dressed in the same suit he had worn when he supposedly left for Chicago. In his hand, he held the remote to the house's security system. "Robert, thank God!" Mary shrieked, her voice shifting instantly back into a high-pitched plea. This girl tried to push me. She's been stealing from you, "Shut up," Robert said, his voice a low, terrifying growl that silenced the room. He walked down the steps slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "I've been in this house for 3 days, Mary. I saw you turn off my mother's monitors, I heard you toast to my death with Julian, and I watched you strike a woman whose only crime was having the heart you lack." He reached out and gently pulled Clara away from the railing, placing her safely behind him. He looked at the red welt on her cheek, then back at Mary. "Julian, you're going to the docks. My men have a very long night planned for you," Robert said calmly. Julian was dragged out, screaming, while Mary fell to her knees, sobbing for mercy. Robert didn't even look at her. He handed Clara the ledger. "Your brother's surgery is paid for, Clara. And this house? It needs a new head of household, one with a heart of gold." As Mary was led away in handcuffs, Robert turned toward his mother's room, finally ready to be the son she deserved, guided by the light of the maid who had saved them both.